Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us today for the second installment of our conversation with Dr. John Canty, entitled The Gangur, Holy Relic, Time Capsule, or Goldmine. This was initially intended as a one-off event, but because we discovered that there was such an abundance of interest in this topic, and because John is such a wealth of knowledge, we decided to expand this into a three-part series. So today is the second of these conversations, and it will be 1.5 hours long, which will hopefully give us more time for questions at the end. Please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A function. And just a very brief recap of what 84,000 is and who we, your hosts, are, for those of us who are joining for the first time today. So 84,000 is a global nonprofit, non-sectarian initiative with a mission to translate the entire Tibetan Buddhist Canon, that is the Kangyur and the Dengue, into modern languages, with the specific goal of completing a full English version in 100 years. Last year, 84,000 celebrated its 10th anniversary and currently has over 50% of the Gangur published, about to be published, or in translation. All of the published texts are freely available online. And Dr. John Canty is 84,000's editorial co-director and has been with 84,000 since its inception. He is also a celebrated translator of Buddhist texts in his own right. And my name is Joy Chen. I am a PhD candidate in Buddhist studies at Harvard University. And recently I've also become an associate editor at 84,000. Okay, now let's welcome John to the stage. Hi, John. So last time we were barely able to even scratch the surface of all the content that we had wanted to cover. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to speak with you again. And last time you provided us with a really nice overview of the historical and geographical context for Buddhism's eventual arrival in Tibet. But we didn't have much time to discuss the actual formation of the Tibetan canon or its contents, really. So shall we start there? Will you walk us through that, please?
Sure, okay. Yes, hello everybody. It's good to be here again. I'm so sorry, last time we kind of got really short of time. I guess we should have planned it better, but I'm always a little bit too ready to just go on and on talking about insignificant details and not very good at keeping time. So let's hope we do better this time. But anyway, we have a lot more space to elaborate a bit. And basically, I want to spend this talk more on the contents of the Kanjio and showing you all kind of what's in the Kanjio. But we thought it would be good to kind of recap a little bit on the history because it has an important bearing on what we're going to say. So just to recap very briefly, last time I kind of explained a little bit and showed some maps of how the Buddhist texts from India were kind of swirling around Asia from quite early on, but it took, they went all around Tibet, and especially south and to the east, down to Southeast Asia, and also up north, in fact, via the kind of northwest corner of India and along the Silk Road into China. Some of them went to China by the sea route too. And the text even got as far as Japan before they were really being noticed very much in Tibet, as far as we know. Of course, we don't really know what was happening, but it was only in the 7th, 8th centuries that the Tibetans began to really take notice of the Buddhist texts. And when they did, they really took to it in a big way. So we had this early period, the imperial period of translation, when really virtually all of the sutras and a lot of the Vinaya and a lot of the other material that's now in the Kanjio was translated within a really very short time, within about 100 years. Some of it may have been done may have been started a little bit earlier, but it was a huge imperially sponsored effort to translate all the texts. And then, you know, the imperial system kind of collapsed. And there was, I suppose, in about the sort of early 9th century. And then there was actually quite a long hiatus for about 200 years when nothing much happened in the way of translation. Again, as far as we know, there may have been more than, than meets the eye. And then, you know, starting in the 11th century with Rinchen Zangpo, sponsored by, you know, the king of Guge, and the arrival in Tibet of Atisha, and the sort of arising of the Kadampa tradition, and then the Drogmi and the Sakya tradition, and then the of course Marpa, and bringing in the whole what became the Kaju tradition. Then we had the whole period of what's called the later translations. And that lasted for another, I suppose, 100, 150, maybe 200 years. Kind of slowly, there were fewer and fewer texts coming into Tibet, and I suppose the very last texts to be translated were probably in the 14th century. But in all of that time, there was no actual Kanjur. There was nothing called the Kanjur. There were these collections of scriptures in different monasteries. And there were some lists that were written even in the early period of all the texts that had been translated. But nobody had really kind of assembled them into one great big thing and called it the Kanjur, or the Tenjur for that matter. So all of these texts were around. There were probably different copies. They were being copied from one monastery to the next. Some monasteries had better copies than other copies. And for some reason, we don't really know exactly why, but in about the 14th century, a bunch of people around, really in between Sakya and Gyaltsen in central Tibet, started having the idea, you know, we could do something about this. You know, we could actually sort of systematize it and collect together the scriptures and the translations, and to kind of edit them a bit and make them into a collection. And this seemed to start off probably, as far as we know, at the monastery of Natang, which is in that same area, not very far from what's now Shigatse. And also at the monastery of Tsel Gungtang, which is again nearby, and Shalu. And it kind of went a little bit in that order, first at Natang, and then Tsel Gungtang, then Shalu and Gyaltsen. And Bhutan, the famous Bhutan, was in Shalu. He wasn't actually, you know, sort of single-handedly responsible for the Kanjur, like some people think. You know, it was all happening before he started work, but he did contribute a huge amount, especially to the Tenjur, actually. But he made these kind of lists of what had been translated, and the other thing, of course, he did, and it happened not very long before that, was he started writing histories of the Dharma. And the Tibetans didn't seem to be particularly interested in history long before that. I think they were very interested in lineage, but that's not quite the same thing. And so you start to see Tibetan histories appearing more in the 13th century, perhaps, the first ones, sometimes even earlier, but they weren't, it didn't really become a big thing until the 14th century. And then the Kanjurs and the Tenjurs as well began to emerge as collections and were being edited, and people were trying to find the best copies of everything and to try to arrange the scriptures in some sort of order. And so there was you could almost say, a sort of craze for Kanjurs, and it became quite a thing for different monasteries and probably different rulers as well to sponsor work on the Kanjur. It became seen as a kind of meritorious activity. And one of the earliest versions to appear was at Tsel Gungtang, at the monastery of Tsel Gungtang, and that's called the Tsalpa Kangyur. And it was initially it was a manuscript copy of a whole lot of translations, and it had been arranged in a certain way with the texts in a certain order. And then not very long afterwards, another kind of lineage, if you like, emerged of Kangyurs, which is called that first one at Tsel Gungtang is called the Tsalpa. Not sure if I said that or not. And that's called the Tsalpa Kangyur. And then another one arose, which was in Gyaltsen, called the Tempangma manuscript. And we're not quite sure, the Tsalpa's disappeared as such. And we're not quite sure if the Tempangma still exists or not, but there are some very good copies of it. And ever since then, all the many Kangyurs that have been edited and printed, and there are about, I think there are about 30 different Kangyurs. They've all been based on those two early versions. And some of them are based on more on the Tsalpa. Some of them are based more on the Tempangma. And there's a lot of cross currents. So, you know, people who are editing one Kangyur from, say, the Tsalpa tradition would probably look at some of the Tempangma versions and vice versa. But nowadays, the Tsalpa versions are basically the printed Kangyurs, and the Tempangma, the ones that are descended from the Tempangma, are mostly manuscript Kangyurs. They're beautiful, actually. Some of them are very beautifully scripted, and they tend to be rather easier to read than the Tsalpa Kangyurs, which were printed and, of course, made from wood blocks. And wood block printing was, you know, a great innovation, obviously, in terms of ease of spreading, making new copies. But some of the older ones that we still have now are quite difficult to read.
Yeah, with time they really wear down. And
yeah, that's right. The more they're
printing, also it can get really hard to read. Yeah.
And of course, they're very hard to correct too. You've got a wooden block with all the letters carved.
Yes.
And yeah. So, and actually, yes, this is a good point to bring in the question from somebody, I think called Silver,
yes,
who was asking, when was the first Kanjio printed? So that's a very good question. It's not actually the first Kanjio, of course, because there are these manuscripts that existed, but the first Kanjio was printed surprisingly early. It was printed in China, in Nanjing in China, in 1410. And it was a version, it was probably made from, the woodblocks were made from a version of the Tsalpa Kanjio. And it's now called the Yongle Kanjio. And it was made during the Ming Dynasty and sponsored by the Emperor Yongle, made in Nanjing. And of course, copies of this first print were sent all over the place. And the very first copies were preserved in a temple in Wutaishan.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to interject and say, I think it was Beijing, not...
was it? Okay.
Yes, but yes.
You may be right. You may be right. I read Nanjing somewhere, but I don't know. Anyway, later Kanjios were certainly printed in Beijing as well and became known as the Beijing or Peking Kanjios. And there were a whole succession of them sort of related. But anyway, just to cut a very long story short, because we could get lost in this, there are now, as I said, probably 7 or 8 really well-known Kanjios and another maybe up to 20 or so that exist that all are basically, they have the same content. The way the texts are arranged is different. And on the level of, you know, individual texts, there are some minor differences. Of course, whenever you have something copied out or carved for that matter, the person doing it can make a few mistakes here and there, spelling mistakes, or miss out, you know, a section or a page or something. So it's very helpful now that we have all of these different versions of the Kanjur to compare and to, be able to kind of try and guess what, if there are mistakes or something that doesn't make sense, we can sometimes see, why that's so and what the reading should be. But also they were produced, at different times in different centuries, and they also give us a kind of history of, what was being done to the Kanjur by successive editors. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. And finally, I'd just like to say, this is, it's been an amazing difference in the last, I suppose, 20 years for those of us, especially like me, who live in the middle of the countryside. And we do actually here in the Dordogne have an amazing library, which is the what's part of what was brought from Tibet by Kangyur Rinpoche himself when he left, and looked after by his family. But there's no university library for we have several hours train ride or car drive to get there. But nowadays, we don't really need it. I can sit on this very seat and not have to even get up to be able to find online, thanks to especially BDRC, the Buddhist Digital Resources Center, an incredible array of scans of all of these texts, of all of these kanjurs. So there's now quite easily obtainable, at least 15 different kanjurs. And they've been sort of preserved and made available free to everybody. And anybody who's seriously into studying these texts would, of course, be totally lost without the BDRC site and its incredible work in preserving them. There's another wonderful site called the Resources for Kanjur and Tenjo Studies at Vienna, run by the University of Vienna, which is also a very good place to look for, especially some of the rarer kanjurs. They have scans of some of the far-flung kanjurs from Bhutan and Ladakh and other places that, have slightly different readings. So it's wonderful to be able to study all of these versions. So having done that rather sort of breathless survey of the sort of formations of the Kanjur, I thought we better jump straight in, otherwise we're going to run out of time very quickly. And to let you know something about the content and what is in the Kanjur. So I've made a sort of chart which gives you some idea of the size of the different sections. Now, of course, as the saying goes, size isn't everything. So there are a lot of short texts and there are a lot of long texts, but let me try and show you if I can get it up on my screen here.
And actually, John, I want to retract a previous statement I made. I think you were right. I think it was Nanjing. I got confused. I'm sorry to everyone. I'm going to check later, but I think you were right. I got confused for a second because the Ming moved their capital to Nanjing. Anyway, yes, I think you were right.
Well, Joy, I'm sure you know far more about Chinese history. I'm a real amateur in that field, as in most others. But yeah, so here is a sort of comparative chart of of what's in the Kanjur. Now, each of those rectangle sort of icons represents a volume. So as you can see, there are just over 100 volumes, 101, I think. And this is following the scheme that is the case for most Tsalpa Kanjurs, but not the Tempangma Kanjurs, which are arranged in a slightly different order. This is actually following the Dengue Kanjur, which is the one that we base most of it's our kind of foundation for the 84,000. Of course, we need to look at all of the Kanjurs, but it's the one we kind of start with as the baseline. So essentially, there are 4 different groups, I suppose you could say, of genres. And there's the discipline section or the Vinaya section. There are the sutras themselves, the discourses, which contains quite a few varieties. And then there's the Tantra section. And then in some Kangyurs, there is a compendium of Dharanis at the end, which is a kind of extra. So we'll talk about all of that, one section after another. And so this chart kind of gives you an idea of the weight of the different sections in terms of how many volumes and how many pages. You can see some, I don't know if you can see, I'm so sorry for people who are following on a very small device. This is all a bit too small. But if you want later, you'll be able to look at our recording on YouTube with a bigger screen, perhaps. And there are some numbers here, which are maybe not terribly obvious. There's a kind of yellow number after each section, which tells you how many volumes. And the number in mauve after that is the number of texts in each section. So as you can see, just to begin with, on the discipline section, the Vinaya section, there are 13 volumes, and there are actually only 7 texts in this section. In other ones, if you look down at the General Sutra section, you can see that there are 32 volumes, but there are no less than 267 texts. So obviously, texts of different size. But so this chart gives you an idea of the kind of weight of the different sections. So let's start with the Vinaya. And I'm not going to keep this chart up all the time, because otherwise we'll never sort of have a chance to see each other. But for the time being, I'll keep it up, and then when I can, I'll take it down and put it up again. So the discipline section, Vinaya, there are said to be sort of 4 different main sections of Vinaya, which are called the Dulwa Lungshi, the 4 transmissions of Vinaya. And the first one, although it's not in the first, it's not very first in the Kanjio, is the Pratimoksa Sutras, which basically lay out the rules for monks. There's a Pratimoksa for monks, for bhikshus, gelongs, and there's a Pratimoksa for nuns or bhikshunis. And I've put PS here in the you can see it's on the second group here, and that's where the Pratimoksa Sutra itself is in this 5th volume. And the Bhikshuni Pratimoksa is in the 9th volume. And then along with those Pratimoksa Sutras is what are called the Vinaya Vibhanga, which are basically commentaries or expansions, and they explain the different precepts. So there are for monks wait a minute, there's a little bit more I ought to explain first. The Vinaya sections, it's a little bit complicated. After the Buddha's lifetime, various different sanghas and groups developed, and after some of the councils, they had slight differences of opinion about what was important about the rules. Poor Ananda gets blamed for some of this, because at some point during the Buddha's life, he said, the Buddha said to him, there are some, after I've passed away, there are some minor rules that don't necessarily have to be kept. And Ananda was supposed to ask which ones they were, but he never quite did somehow. I think he didn't really like to talk about what would happen after the Buddha passed away. And so after he had passed away, there were these kind of disagreements about which ones he was talking about. And that's kind of one of the reasons. But anyway, gradually different groups developed. And there were sort of the so-called 18 different Nikayas or different schools that developed with differences in their minor rules. And they had their own bodies of Vinaya texts that they developed. Of course, many of them contain very much the same material, but in different amounts and with slight differences. And one set developed from what's called the Stavira Nikaya and became the Pali Vinaya texts. And the others, there were basically about 5 different bodies of Vinaya texts which developed, and the Tibetans only adopted one set. The other ones, there's the Dharmaguptaka, which is the sort of predominant Vinaya rule in China. There's the Savastivada, the Mahishasaka, the Mahasangika, and the Mula Savastivada. And the one that went to Tibet and was adopted there and is now makes up the Vinaya section in the Kanjio is from the Mula Savastivadin Vinaya Pitaka, if you like. And the Chinese have translations of all of those 5, but the Tibetan version of the Mula Savastivadin is probably the biggest of all of the Vinaya collections that exist now. And you might think it's all kind of not very relevant for most of us because it's all about the monks' rules. But in fact, there's a lot more to it than that. And the Vinaya section here, this Vinaya section, is really almost like a kind of canon in itself. And it contains a lot of the kind of material in different form, but it contains a lot of material, stories and so forth that you might find in the whole of the Pali Canon, actually. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And the Mula Savastivadin Vinaya people put into their Vinaya Pitaka all the literature that they could get their hands on almost. And so it's a huge collection of stories, narratives, things about the life of the Buddha, past life stories, legends, biography, all kinds of things that are sort of spread out amongst this material that are actually on the vows. So, sorry, that was a sort of long digression into what the different Vinayas are. But here in the Vinaya Vibhanga, you have explanations of how all the vows came about. And in the Mula Savastivadin Vinaya, there are 253 rules for monks, and there are 364, I think, for nuns. And when the Buddha started collecting a Sangha around him, there weren't any rules. He just said, come monk, follow me. And that was what the ordination consisted of. And the story goes that when he asked monks to follow him, they kind of immediately, their hair became as if shaved, and they had the robes on, and they looked like monks, instantaneously. But there were no vows, and they were just expected to follow the Buddha and to, that they were going to form a kind of group of practitioners. But then, of course, people started to explore the limits of what they might be allowed to do. And every time something happened that needed a rule, the Buddha would make a rule that sort of prevented that mishap from happening again. So for each of the rules, there's a kind of story, there's a backstory of why it was necessary. And that basically makes up the content of the second group of texts that you see here, the Vinaya Vibhanga, which is the 5th to 8th volumes. And then the ones for nuns is the next one, the 9th volume. So the first 4 volumes are taken up with what's called the second of these transmissions of the Vinaya, which is called the Vinaya Vastu. And it basically consists of chapters on different topics. So there are topics like ordination, the rites of restoration, what's called sojong, the relaxation of restrictions, the rains retreats, medicines, robes, the formal acts, accommodation, beds, and all of those kind of things. I won't give you a complete list because it would take too long. But again, the Vinaya Vastu is a fascinating text. It's an enormous text. It's got huge amounts of different material in, and we mentioned last time in the first chapter, which is on ordination or going forth, we saw this very, very long sort of joint biography of Shariputra and Mangalyayana, and how they sort of were seeking spiritual truth and eventually came across the Buddhist teachings after after studying with many gurus and philosophers and all kinds of people. And so it's a little bit similar for the other chapters. There are huge digressions from the actual Vinaya material. One of the biggest ones is on medicines, and actually that'll be the next one that we publish, a translation of. It's full of extraordinary, very fascinating stories. One of the stories that we've already published a sutra on, which is a kind of standalone extract, was the story of entering the city of Vaishali and how the Buddha quelled the epidemic there. It's obviously very relevant to our times. There are lots of other amazing stories. There's the whole story of Amrapali, who was one of the Buddha's women disciples who also lived in Vaishali. And some of it is vaguely to do with medicine and treatment and illness and so forth. But a lot of it is, the connection is a little bit hard to see. And the longest of all the chapters of the Vinaya Vastu comes at the end, is the 17th chapter, and it's called the Sangha Bedavastu, the chapter on the schism in the Sangha. And it's essentially, it's a very detailed biography of the Buddha and his whole life. And it's really extremely interesting. We have somebody working on translating that, and it will be ready probably within a couple of years. And it's an amazing text. It's the sort of most detailed biography of the Buddha that we have. So yeah, there's lots more I could say about that, but I better keep it short.
Can I just add on to everything you just said and say that it's so true that I think most of the time we think of the Vinaya as, a lot of us think, oh, it's a collection that has nothing much to do with me or to do with us, because if we're not monks or nuns, then it's just the rules for the Sangha. But it's actually so much more than that. And I'm in no way sort of very well versed in the Vinaya, but from the little that I've read, it's amazing. I mean, the amount of stories that are in there, and I feel like it's the place where, for the rest of the canon, a lot of it in the sutras, most of the time you get the sense that it's a very kind of formal teaching setting, right? It's the Buddha teaching to a group of disciples. But in the Vinaya, you actually get to see things that may have actually happened during the Buddha's time, like as in, the encounters he had with his disciples, the questions they asked him that were like practical questions about how do we live together as a community of disciples. And it's so true. It's like every rule seemed to have come about through an actual encounter with a problem, right? Which makes it it's so interesting to me. And
it's very interesting. There's even a group. There's one chapter on them called the Group of Troublesome Monks, or sometimes called the Naughty Monks. And they were the ones who did absolutely everything to explore the limits of what they were allowed to do, and the things that they got up to are totally outrageous. And each time they did it, the Buddha very patiently created a rule that would sort of prevent that happening again. And I think he was in a way quite grateful to these naughty monks for having made things extremely clear. But of course, they are partly responsible for there being so many rules that have to be kept.
Right.
So, yeah, and then finally, for the rest of the Vinaya section, we have the Vinaya Kshudraka Vastu, which is the third of the big groups there. It has 2 volumes, and it's a kind of extra chapter which has all kinds of incredible details as well. So it goes over some of them same material, but it has more parts that aren't in there. Just a very quick example is that it has this amazing section on embryology, of all things. There's a kind of narrative when the Buddha is trying to persuade his half-brother Nanda to stay a monk. Nanda's trying, but he's sort of having trouble. He was just married, and he's kind of hesitating which way to go. And but anyway, the Buddha gives him a lot of really interesting teachings, and some of it is very comical as well. But one of the things is he's explaining how he was born and what that entailed. And he goes through, there's this long description of all the different stages that a human embryo goes through before developing and being born. And for the time, it's an amazing piece of scientific observation, if you like. Anyway, that's just one of many, many things. And then the fourth of the main sections is called the Vinaya Granta, and is a sort of collection of texts, of extra texts. A lot of it's taken up with the questions of Upali. Upali was the barber to a lot of the Buddha's family, some of his cousins and so forth, who also became monks and joined him. And Upali didn't want to be left behind, and he became, in the end, the sort of specialist in the Vinaya, and is the person to whom a lot of the questions were addressed. And he's the person who is said to have remembered all of the Vinaya teachings in the same way that Ananda is the one who remembers all of the sutra teachings. So anyway, sorry to cut everything brief, but we have to move on. So now the next big section is called the sutras themselves, and this is divided traditionally into different genres in the Kanjur. And the first of them is the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And I should have explained right at the beginning, but in fact, in the Kanjio catalogue written by Situpanchen Chökyi, he describes how the Kanjio is laid out in terms of the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. And so he says it's not completely as you might read about the 3 turnings in other texts, but basically the Vinaya represents the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. So it's based on the 4 Noble Truths, on suffering, on avoiding suffering, the Vinaya rules, and the Pratimoksa is to kind of at least escape doing some of the negative karmic actions that will lead to suffering in the future, if you like. So that's the sort of, it represents the kind of Shravaka Yana, or the basic vehicle approach to the Dharma. And then the second turning of the wheel of Dharma was about essentially emptiness. It was essentially how things don't have a kind of inherent existence of any kind. And so this is basically the sort of beginnings of the Mahayana tradition in some ways. Some of these Perfection of Wisdom Prajnaparamita texts represent the earliest Mahayana sutras that we know about. And they're an extraordinary body of literature. And as you can see here, they represent quite a large proportion of the Kanjur. And they're basically built on, they're difficult to read. They're built on a huge sort of analysis of all of the different factors that make up samsara, but also the path, and also the qualities of awakening. nirvana, if you like, but the qualities of Buddhahood and so forth. And all of those different, sometimes Buddhism is described as a bullet point religion because there are so many lists. And you find all of the lists here. It was sort of derived from the early so-called the matrikas, these sort of lists of things that people ought to know about, the topics of what the world is actually made of. And the Prajnaparamita sutras kind of go through all of these lists, and they put them into a kind of order that is important in terms of the practicing the path. But they also say at the same time, they must not be taken as intrinsically existing. So the bodhisattva, the person who's trying to attain awakening, has to practice them, take them seriously on a sort of relative level, and at the ultimate level, not believe in any of them. And so, it's always sort of paradoxical and difficult to get that and to understand it. And the Buddha, according to these sutras, the Buddha spent an enormous amount of time explaining exactly how and making sure that not a single detail was left as something that should be taken as truly existing, as it were. And it's said that he gave these teachings in different forms that were adapted to different kinds of beings and perhaps even different realms. And the teachings were said to have been concealed and sort of rediscovered later, and that there were some of the different forms we don't have anymore. So we have the biggest one of all that we have in the Kanjio is called the Prajnaparamita in 100,000 lines, and it occupies no less than 12 volumes of the Kanjio. It's enormous. And then the next one down is the 25,000 line, then the 18,000 line version, and the 10,000 line version, which we've actually published a translation of already, the 8,000 line, and then there's a whole lot of shorter ones, which I'll describe in a minute. And there are said to have been even longer ones. There's one, it's said that there was a version in 1 billion lines that was preserved by the Gandharvas. The gods were allowed to have one that had 1 million lines. And the 100,000 line one was actually designed originally for the Nagas. And the legend goes, according to the traditional Buddhist history, that Nagarjuna, who is this great 2nd century Buddhist scholar and adept, went down to the Naga realms and retrieved them and brought them back into the human realm and sort of propagated them, particularly in southern India. But there are also places, I've seen one in Kathmandu. There's a temple which has a sort of what looks like a well, which is said to have been where Nagarjuna emerged, bringing the 100,000 line Prajnaparamita with him back from the Naga realm. So anyway, these versions of the text all exist, and some people think that they're just a sort of the difference is just in the degree of repetition. But somehow each of these different versions of the Prajnaparamita has their kind of specificity and their style, and there's something very special about them. And something happens to people who study the Prajnaparamita in detail. They become, I would say, almost obsessed by it. And you probably won't see them much for the rest of their lives. So you get very specialized scholars, and this was certainly the case in Tibet. People would become specialized in this, what they call parchin or Parutuchimba, parchin for short studies, where you'd have specialized kind of colleges that would teach it, and specialized kempos and lamas and geshes who would know all about it. And it's almost another world, but incredibly important, and really the source of all kinds of extraordinary insights. And of course, in the end, most of the systematized drupta, or the sort of philosophical teachings, derived from the Prajnaparamita, for example, the Madhyamika, and probably all kinds of other practice traditions, and perhaps in China and Japan, the Chan and Zen traditions as well. So it's complicated. There are said to be 6 mother sutras, and the rest are considered the so-called daughter sutras. And the reason for this is that the longer ones, well, I have to take it back a little bit further. One of the ways that the Prajnaparamita has been interpreted was through the commentary written by Asanga. And again, this is a long story. He was inspired, basically almost dictated. This commentary was almost dictated by Maitreya to Asanga when he, after a long period of research and retreat and everything, he was taken off by Maitreya to the Tushita heaven and taught for an amount of time, which is variable according to the accounts. And he came back with the famous 5 texts of Maitreya. And the story goes that he was basically, all of the 5 texts were attempts to understand the Prajnaparamita teachings, which were incredibly, he could kind of master all of the other sutras and different texts, but it was particularly the Prajnaparamita that was really difficult. And so the kind of main commentary that's directly on the Prajnaparamita is called the Abhisamaya, and it is one of the most difficult texts to understand, and it has 8 topics and describes how this whole, everything that's mentioned in the Prajnaparamita Sutras can be seen in terms of 8 different topics, or 8 different objects, if you like, of clear realization. The Abhisamaya basically means the ornament of clear realizations. And each of these 8 topics with subdivisions are the things that need to be kind of teased out by studying and practicing the Prajnaparamita. And the so-called 6 mother sutras are the ones that cover all of these 8 topics. And the ones that only cover 1 or 2 topics are considered the sort of children or daughter sutras. So all of the first group, the 100,000 lines, 25,000 lines, 18,000, 10,000 down to the 8,000 are considered the 6 mothers, along with a verse summary, which is actually a chapter in some of the longer ones, but is also a standalone text called the Ratna Guna Samchaya Gata. And those cover all of these 8 topics. And then we'll find in the final volume of this text, there's actually some very important texts, like everybody's heard of the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra, the Vajrachedika. And there are sutras in 500 lines, in 150 lines, in 50 lines. There's sutras in a single phrase, and there's even a sutra of the Prajnaparamita in a single letter. It's not quite that short because it has an introduction and a conclusion as well. And then there's a whole lot of Prajnaparamita sutras which are written for particular people. So anyway, so that's, I'm getting too lengthy in all of these descriptions, but again, that's a very brief description of the Prajnaparamita sutras. And then again, just to mention, in that final volume, I talked about this last time, there are 13 texts which were translated from the Pali, and with the latest additions to the Kanjio in the 14th century. So they're called the late translated sutras. And they were traditionally recited for protection, but they cover a variety of subjects, and they're not really anything to do with the Prajnaparamita. That's just where they're kind of placed.
Really interesting. Why are they placed there?
Well, some people think it's because they were considered very auspicious, because they were recited for protection. It may just be a a practical matter, you know, that if you put all the short Prajnaparamita texts into a volume, it doesn't fill the volume. So you could, you know, use it to as a place to park these other ones. But anyway, that's where they are, in at least in the Dengue Kanjur. In some other Kanjurs, they're elsewhere. Mm. So I'm going to have to move on quickly, and I apologize for spending too long on each section, but
no, it's all very interesting. I'm sure no one is complaining.
So then the next section is the Avatamsaka, or the ornaments of the Buddhas, sometimes interpreted as a multitude of Buddhas. And this is a fascinating text, you could say. It's considered as a one sutra. It's a vast, what's called a Vaipulya Sutra, an extended sutra. But in fact, we can see historically that it's kind of probably some of the texts or chapters that make it up existed as independent texts in India, and they were gradually put together over the centuries and became kind of one, considered as one sutra. This is kind of included in the, now we're getting to what's called the third turning in terms of the catalogue. So this Avatamsaka text, or the texts that make it up, are Mahayana texts. They deal with the progress of bodhisattvas. And what's very interesting really here is the Avatamsaka is built around the idea that actually all the Buddhas, and it deals with the multitudes of Buddhas, almost infinite Buddhas in different Buddha fields and different universes, and also the idea that everything is contained in everything else. So there's Buddha fields on different scales. You know, there's Buddha fields down in many Buddha fields down in the tiniest atom, and our vast universe is perhaps only an atom in another even vaster Buddha field, and so forth. But all Buddhas are enlightened from the very beginning, along with Vairochana, who's considered the sort of primordial Buddha in Avatamsaka terms. So that means that bodhisattvas, who are destined to become Buddhas, are in a way only going through the motions. You know, they're kind of appearing to be bodhisattvas, going through the different stages of the path. And a lot in the Avatamsaka is about the different stages that bodhisattvas kind of manifest that they're going through. But at the same time, the stages are very important. And the Avatamsaka is one of the important sources of the different stages of the bodhisattva path. And it's a really fascinating text. The texts that belong to it, they certainly all have the same kind of taste about them, and they have a certain coherence. The first 29, or it has 45 chapters altogether. And the first 29 or so are a kind of coherent story where the Buddha is addressing, well, that's perhaps not right to say. The Avatamsaka basically takes place after the Buddha's enlightenment, but before he starts to speak, which is, you know, part of the traditional story, that he hesitated for some weeks before actually starting to teach. And so the teachings in the Avatamsaka are given mainly by Samantabhadra and Manjushri and other bodhisattvas. And then it culminates in this amazing text called the Gandavyuha, which takes up about the last third of the Avatamsaka, which is a wonderful, it's almost, I suppose it's the closest thing in the Kanjio to a novel. It's a kind of pilgrim's progress, and describes the spiritual path, the spiritual seeking of a young person called Sudana, who meets 53 different spiritual teachers and learns from them, each one a little bit, and then they advise him to go on to find the next one. And he kind of goes through all of these, again, stages of his sort of spiritual awakening until he, at the very end, he meets Samantabhadra, who he's already met at the beginning, and kind of merges with him in a sense. And that's his, almost his awakening. And then it culminates in this text, which is probably the best known part of the Avatamsaka in the Tibetan tradition, which is the prayer of Samantabhadra's action, or the prayer of good action, which is recited in most monasteries and in many Western Dharma centers as well. So, yes, there'd be a huge amount to say about the Avatamsaka, but we're going to run out of time, so I'm sorry. Just to say that the Avatamsaka is the kind of basic foundation of a whole school of Chinese Buddhism, the Huayan tradition. It wasn't very much studied in Tibet as such. It was enormously respected and appreciated, but it wasn't really used a great amount, except for the Gandavyuha was very widely quoted. And of course, as I mentioned, the prayer of good action right at the end is kind of universally used. Okay, so moving on quickly, the next section is the heap of jewels, or the Ratnakuta. And so this is basically a collection of sutras. It's an anthology. It has 49 texts, and again in the catalogue of the Kanjio, in Situ Pengen's Karchak, he describes it as again part of the third turning of the Wheel of Dharma. But in fact, the sutras that compose the Ratnakuta are on all kinds of subjects. You know, there are some which are almost Vinaya texts. There's a special Vinaya for Bodhisattvas, and there are texts which are really, you could say, are sort of based on the Shravakayana view, on the Four Truths and so forth. There are sort of Bodhisattva texts. There are Pure Land texts on Buddha fields. There are some very sophisticated philosophical texts, and there are stories. There's a huge range of texts. I suppose you could say what they have in common is that they are all. It makes a very good collection together. It's a very representative selection of sutras, and it makes a very nice anthology. You know, it's almost like all the sutras that you really need. Not that anybody treats it like that, but it's an anthology. And it's not completely sure whether it existed as a collection in India. It probably did, but most references in Indian texts to the Ratnakuta actually refer to one of the texts that are in it, called the Kashyapa Parivarta, the chapter on Kashyapa, and not to the collection itself. But the Ratnakuta was, some of the texts are known to have existed independently in India, quite a few of them. Some of them are much older. But the Ratnakuta was translated into Chinese a little bit before it was translated into Tibetan. And it was translated into Chinese by Bodhiruchi, who collected the texts in the 8th century, at the beginning of the 8th century. And he, in fact, 23 of the texts that he collected and put in the Ratnakuta already existed in previous Chinese translations. And he added 26 of his own. He may well have been following a kind of Indian model. And we don't quite know what the connection is between the Ratnakuta in Chinese translation and the Ratnakuta in Tibetan translation, but the contents are pretty much the same. And so it must have followed the same model, but some of the translations in the Tibetan Ratnakuta were translated directly from Sanskrit. And a few of them are known to have been translated from Chinese, maybe more. So, you know, there's quite a lot that remains to be discovered. There's some amazing philological work that's happening at the moment in the University of Leiden under Jonathan Silk, they have a team exploring all of the relationships between the different source texts, whether they're Sanskrit, Chinese, or Tibetan, or even in other languages, of the sutras that make up of the heap of jewels as a kind of pilot project for doing the same thing for larger numbers of sutras. Mm. So again, lots more we could say about the Ratnakuta, but time is moving on. We're almost at the hour already. So the General Sutra section is, of course, a large part of the Kanjio, 32 volumes, so almost a third. It's probably the best known section. It has a huge range of different sutras in it. As you can see from this graphic of mine, which I meant to take down, and I've had it up all the time, sorry about that. The bulk of it is made up of Mahayana sutras. And it starts off with the sort of most famous ones, the Bhadrakalpika Sutra, which is the sutra that describes the previous vows and times and Buddhas under whom all of the Buddhas of this kalpa, of this eon, took the vow of enlightenment, generated the mindset on awakening, and the vows that they took and what they were going to do. So it covers 1,000 different Buddhas, and it goes into astonishing detail about, who their parents were, who their teachers were, what caste they belonged to, and so forth. Then there's the Lalita Vistara, the play in full, which recounts from a Mahayana perspective the life of the Buddha from his birth until just after his enlightenment, just after his awakening. And then there's a lot of other famous sutras, the Lotus Sutra, the Samadhi Raja Sutra, many, many others, some of which have been extensively explored and quoted, some of which are almost unknown. And the sutras in this section are grouped in different ways in different kanjos. They often here grouped according to sort of what's in the title. So there's a whole lot of sutras called the samadhi of something or other, the absorption of something or other, and the sutras called the questions of so-and-so, and the predictions of so-and-so. But they're also, the ways that they've been classified are quite complex and not always terribly evident. But they're all make up, the sort of best known group of sutras probably in the Kanjur. And we're gradually producing translations of many of them. And it's been a really fascinating experience to see what there is in, of course, not only the General Sutra section, the whole of the Kanjur, but particularly in the General Sutra section, there are some sutras that, most of us have never heard of and have no idea what are in them. And it's so interesting to translate and find out, sometimes some wonderful gems of teachings. And basically, I'm hoping to spend the next session, the third talk, on bringing up some of the sort of really interesting points that we've found and that, of course, some of them known to exist. And then this big section that you can see on the graphic of Mahayana sutras takes up about 2/3 of the General Sutra section. And there comes a kind of point in the Karchak, in the catalogue, where it's said that the rest are now belonging to the Hinayana, which is a slightly pejorative term, but basically meaning the Shravakayana. Not everybody agrees with this classification. And the so-called Hinayana section starts with this amazing sutra called the Smriti Upasthana, Sadharma Smriti Upasthana, the sutra of recollection of the holy Dharma or the pure Dharma. And it's 4 volumes by itself. And we recently published it, the translation of it. And it's this amazing kind of survey of all the different realms. And it goes into incredible detail of the experience of the beings in all of these different realms and why they're there and what happens to them, particularly emphasis on the different God realms and the, what people see, what they experience, and so forth, but also in the sort of animal and asura and hell realms and so forth. And it's probably incomplete. It ends up with a slightly strange section on how a lot of human health problems are caused by parasites. And again, with huge numbers of detail about the different parasites and all their names that affect different parts of the body and sort of torture us. So that's a very interesting part of the Kanjio, again, very little explored. And then towards the end, there's a lot of...
Sorry, that one is Tohoku 287, right?
287.
Okay, great. I'm going to give everyone the link so that
yes,
can read it if they would like to.
Yeah, do read it. It's not something you're going to be able to read in a hurry, but it's really fascinating. And towards the end, we have a lot of material from what are called the Avadanas, which are the kind of legends. Some of them are previous life stories, but they're basically sort of, I suppose you could say, Buddhist morality tales, and they explain what the results of particular actions are and how those results kind of translated into the experience of lives of different individuals, some of which are historical, some of which are sort of, well, legendary, I suppose you could say. And one of the texts there is the 100 Deeds, the Karma Shataka, which is a huge collection of stories, more than 100 actually, which again exemplify the workings of karma over different lifetimes. And basically is derived, it's actually quite close to some of the material in the Vinaya section. It comes basically from the Mulasavasthavadin tradition again. And there are quite a lot of other collections. There's a collection called the Avadana Shataka, which in the Kanjur is called the Avadanas of Purna and others, and but also exists in Sanskrit and is a kind of similar collection. And then there are some individual Avadana stories. There's many more things in that final section, very interesting section of the General Sutra, but we're going to have to keep moving. So now the next big division is the Tantras. And there's a lot to say, and more than I can possibly even try and say. But let me just say this. The Kanjur was essentially the people who produced the first Kanjurs were basically allied to the traditions that arose from the later translation period. So what happened was, in the first translation, in the imperial translation period, the Tibetans went off to India and they studied in various places, some of them at the big monastic colleges, Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odantapuri, and so forth, and some of them in out-of-the-way places. And they met, as well as bringing back sutras and Vinaya and all the rest, they also came across the tantric traditions that existed in India at the time. And in some ways, you could say that the period of the imperial translations kind of coincided with the great development of Tantra in India. And so what the translators came back with to Tibet at that time, they translated, but the imperial edicts made it kind of unlawful, actually, to propagate the Tantras. They had to be kept quite secret and concealed and only used by people who'd had the proper empowerments and the proper instruction and the proper introduction to what they were all about. So the Tantras, the early Tantras kind of stayed out of most of the scriptural collections that were sort of well known and used at the time. But of course they were there. And then when the then there was the sort of period of collapse and everything. And then the new Tantra tradition started when other translators went into India. And of course, they went to different places, generally speaking. And their experiences were quite different. And the Tantras that they came across, the teachings that they came across were mostly, although some of them were related, they were mostly quite different. So when they came back and brought their Tantras, there was kind of a mismatch in a way. It may even be that part of the reason why the Kanjio was kind of collected into a sort of defined collection called the Kanjio was that the later translation people were particularly concerned about the authenticity and lineages of their tantras, and they wanted to sort of prove that the tantras they'd come back with were really authentic and had an Indian lineage. And they claimed that some of the tantras that had existed in the early period didn't, because they hadn't found them in India, they thought, well, maybe they're not really authentic and they didn't really exist, and they're sort of fabricated. So this was, we think anyway, a kind of unfair judgment, but anyway, that's what people thought. So the tantras that are contained in the Kanjio are mostly the tantras that were widely accepted by the later translation tradition. So by the Sakyapas, Kajupas, Gelupas didn't really exist, but the early Kadam schools at that time. And there is, I'll come to that in a minute, but there is a short selection of some of the older tantras that's included in some Kanjurs, but not all. So for the main tantra collection, it's called the Gyubum, the Tantra Compendium. It's divided into 4 different sections, which are basically the way that the Tibetans classified the tantras that were coming in from India in terms of different levels. This is not necessarily something that was done in India, but the Tibetans were great classifiers, and they arranged them according to the, basically according to the sort of level of practice, the level of the view, who they were destined for, and so forth, into 4 different groups, which are called we've called in translation, the unexcelled, but they were also called for a long time, people called them the Anuttara. People now tell us that this is not a word that was ever used in India, and we should call them the Yoganiruttara Tantras, which is perhaps a more authentic way, but the translation anyway is unexcelled, or in Tibetan, Lana Mepa. And these are the kind of highest tantras. And they include the mother tantras and the father tantras. And the mother tantras actually, Bhutan added a kind of extra section to the mother tantras called the Non-Dual Tantras to include what he considered, and many of his contemporaries, the most profound and the highest of all of the tantras, which are the Color Chakra, and related to it, the Manjushri Nama Sangiti. And then there were the other mother tantras, which were basically the Hivadra and the Samvara, Demchok, and some of the, there were some other ones, the Buddha Kapala, Mahamaya, and Vajrarali, sorry. That were the, again, a lot of them based on advanced kind of yoga techniques and have had a very sort of high view. And then the father tantras, which are not necessarily of a lesser view, but they were, again, divided up in a different way. They tended to be, a lot of them are about Akshobhya and Vairocana, Ratnasambhava, Amitabha, Amoghasiddhi, and Vajradhara. So then the next group, which is much smaller, is called the Yoga Tantras, and they're all of the first group are considered to be the sort of inner, and the yoga begins to be the, sometimes called the beginning of the outer tantras. And yeah, I'm not going to go in a lot into the different divisions here. There's not a lot of the yoga tantras. There's even fewer of the conduct tantras, but they have an important bearing on how the tantras developed, and a lot of important information about sort of basic tantra practice and how it was seen. And then this very large group of the action tantras or kriya tantras, which is a very, very interesting section of the Kanjio. It contains a huge amount of material, not all of it particularly tantra, but anything that had Dharanis in it. And again, we'll talk about Dharanis in a minute, but it's all kinds of ritual texts, texts that were for a particular purpose. There is a sort of body of literature on Kriya Tantra, the practice of Kriya Tantra itself. It begins with a huge text called the Manjushri Mula Tantra, the root Tantra of Manjushri. Again, we have a translation of that. And there are similar texts based on Avalokiteshvara and also on Tara. And then this huge miscellaneous collection of texts and Dharanis, things that are recited for particular purposes, things which people are recommended to recite when they have a particular problem of some kind, things which are for what you might call ordinary attainments, things which allow you, to become invisible, or to become incredibly rich, or to live a very long life. All of these, of course, the subtext is in order to be able to practice effectively and to attain awakening, but with sort of catering to your more sort of mundane needs in that respect. But all kinds of things that are used for consecrating and building stupas, things that are used for all kinds of things. Yeah, I'm getting squeezed for time again, so sorry to move on. The Old Tantras is a small section of 3 volumes in some Kangyurs. Some people think that there was one of the early scholars who developed the sort of basic Kanjio structure who wanted to keep these in, and it's thanks to him that we have them. Some of the tantras that were sort of most easily considered authentic by the new schools. And there's one Ati Yoga Dzogchen Tantra. According to the Nyingma tradition, the inner tantras are divided into 3. There's the Ati, Anu, and Maha Yoga. And there's one representative of the Ati Yoga, which is the Dzogchen tradition, called the Kunche Gyalpo. And there are 2 texts which belong to the Anu Yoga level. And the rest, there are texts which are basically from what's called the Gyude, or the section of tantras. They belong to related to the Maya Jala Tantra, and including the Guyagaba Tantra system. And then there are texts which belong to the Drupde, or the means of accomplishment, which are basically the 8 Herukas, the Kapje, that were taught in Tibet by Guru Padmasambhava, and form a big part of the sort of rituals and practices that were used for the Mahayoga texts in the Nyingma system. Much more that we could say, but I'm not going to be able to. And then in the Kanjio, there is finally, to end the Tantra section, there's a commentary on the Color Chakra, which is included, the catalogue say it's included in the Kanjio. It's also in the Tenjio, but it's a commentary because it's sort of almost a sort of original scripture by itself. It's a detailed commentary on the Color Chakra Tantra, and it's considered with a huge amount of respect, called the Vimala Prabha, or the pure light commentary, again, on the Color Chakra Tantra. It takes up 1.5 volumes. And then the final section is the Dharani section, or the Compendium of Dharani, sometimes called Incantations. To describe what a Dharani is would be, again, another whole session. But basically, Dharani is concerned with remembering, memory, retaining, if you like, and it refers to, it refers basically, I suppose, to phrases, something like mantras, but often longer, which kind of carry a certain meaning, which they can carry teachings, they can carry even a profound view, a perspective on the sort of profound view of things, or they can have particular properties that are effective in the world, blessings, ways of remembering much longer teachings. And they're usually phrases in Sanskrit, but they're sometimes applied to the whole text. And the Dharani Compendium in the Kanjio is almost all a set of duplicates of texts from elsewhere. So it contains 265 texts, takes up 2 volumes, and there's only about 8, I think it's 8 or 10 texts in it which are not found already elsewhere in the Kanjio, either in the, some of them in the Sutra section, most of them in the Kriya Tantra section of the Tantras. And again, some very fascinating material. And a lot of the Dharanis were again used for different purposes, different rituals. That includes, for example, the famous Sutra of Long Life. It includes things used for building stupas. It includes texts that people were advised to recite for particular problems, and all kinds of other things as well. So again, a very brief and breathless survey of everything. And if I don't stop now, we're not going to have time for any questions.
No, that was amazing. And just so you know, we have lots of comments of appreciation in the Q&A saying that you shouldn't rush and that they're really enjoying the whole detailed overview. Okay, let's take maybe 2 questions or so. So there's one question from someone that says, how distinct are the different Kangyurs? How many are there? Is it a matter of who translated them and when? And are there some that contain different materials?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, they mostly have exactly the same content. You know, the differences are in the tiny details. It's down on a word level that we may have a slightly different spelling of a different word. There are a few Kangyurs, especially some of the outlying ones, which have a different Tibetan translation than the standard ones. All of the standard ones, really, I think you could say, have perhaps one exception or 2, have the same translations of the same material, and they don't differ a great deal. There's a few outlying Kangyurs that we find in Bhutan and northwestern India and other places that retain some of the earlier or different translations, let's say, alternative ones that had been kind of weeded out in the center of Tibet by the systematizers. So that's quite interesting. But really, otherwise they're the same. The order is different. The way they arrange the texts may be different, but there's not a lot of difference.
Thank you. And we have 2 questions on a similar topic. Gunjok Norbu says, can John say something about the etymology of the terms Gangur and Dengue themselves? And then Tenzin Dickey says, thank you for the lecture. And I am wondering about the very first instances of the word Gangur and Dengue in the literature. If you could say something more about how the words actually came about.
Well, yes, thank you, Konchuk and Tenzin. Yes, thanks. Good idea to put the graphic down. Yes, the Kanjur means, ka means the word. Actually, it's an honorific meaning word, and it means it refers to the words of the Buddha. And gyur means translation. So Kanjur means the words of the Buddha in translation. And tenjur, the ten refers to, it actually means teachings, but it's a kind of reference to the term shastra, or the the treatises. So the Kanjur is the words of the Buddha in translation, and the Tenjur is the treatises in translation. In other words, the texts that commented on the words of the Buddha and were written by the great Indian masters. So, of course, Gyur tells you it was translated, which means it was translated from basically from the Indic languages. Tenzing Diki's asking when the word first appeared, and that is a very interesting question. I don't really know the answer. I don't think it's used before the 14th century. It's not used in the early imperial catalogues as far as I know as such. So it was really used when these collections began to be systematized and people produced a kind of uniform collection.
Yeah, I think that's right. For some reason I remember when I was going through this history for my exams, that there's some people say that it's possible, but this is just very tentative, that maybe Yeshe at some point may have mentioned the word Gangur, but this is a maybe. And then you're right, it's definitely by the time after Bhutan, I think is when kind of Gangur and Dengue became terms that were more widely used. Yeah. Okay, let's see if we have time for one more. Oh, there are just so many questions. We had a question about the first woodblock print, I think. So the Yongle version. I think this is a question from Denzin Sampel, and just about, did the Chinese also craft the Kangyur from wood blocks?
Well, yes, it's interesting, of course, that the first printed Kangyurs were woodblock prints that were made in China. And of course, this was at a period when there were a lot of very strong links between Tibet and China. And I don't know if Emperor Yongle and other emperors at the time actually read Tibetan, but they had an enormous respect for the Tibetan scriptures and the scriptures in Tibetan, and that's why they went to all the trouble to print these Kangyurs. So they, of course, the Chinese had invented this printing technique, of xylographs, carving it on wood and printing it. And I'm not sure about this, but I think there's, a lot of people are sort of have done some very interesting research on the materials used for producing Kangyurs. The Tibetans were particularly good at making paper. And so it was quite possibly a kind of combination of the Tibetan skills in paper making and the Chinese skills in sort of printing technology, woodblock technology, that made it possible to produce these printed Kangyurs really very early on. But I'm not a specialist in those things. I'm not actually a specialist in anything, but the history would be very interesting to explore. But I don't know if Tenzing means by his question, was the Chinese Tripitaka also printed in wood blocks? I honestly don't know. You would know better than I do.
I'm not sure if that was his question, but I think the answer would be no. I think Chinese typesetting generally use a different technology than the type of woodblock pecha kind of printing that we're talking about for the Kanjur. Okay.
It's interesting also that the very first, some of the earliest texts, again, I ought to talk about this more, maybe we could bring it up in the next one. There's a lot of the oldest texts that we know, physically speaking, come from the Central Asian kingdoms, the oasis kingdoms, where the conditions were really good for preservation. And some of them were written not on the long pages that we're so familiar with for the Kanjur, but on actual sheets of paper. And this is partly because people were so good at making paper.
Right.
So that's
yeah. I find the whole history of, you know, places like Khotan so interesting in Central Asia.
Yes, I'd like to talk.
Okay, so we are at time. In fact, we're 1 minute past time, but thank you, John. Thank you to everyone who participated again today. And we will have our third and final conversation of this series at the same time in 2 weeks. So stay tuned for the announcement and the registration link. And we really hope to see all of you there again. In the meantime, take care and thank you, everyone.